Good afternoon to our viewers in Europe and good morning to our viewers in the United States. I'm Steve Sokol, the president of the American Council on Germany, and I'm delighted to welcome you to this fascinating conversation about U.S. foreign policy in the next administration and what that might mean for Europe. We at the ACG are delighted to partner with a dozen or so other transatlantic organizations in Germany and the United States for this virtual discussion, which is part of a larger series called The Road to the Election, which has been spearheaded by the Aspen Institute in Berlin. With less than 2 weeks until Election Day here in the US, many people on both sides of the Atlantic are and have been very curious about the foreign policy and national security priorities of the next US administration. We don't have any crystal balls about the election, and I think it's fair to say that the election will be very, very close. But I am delighted to be joined by two incredibly insightful observers of US policy and of the European and global security landscape. And I'm delighted to welcome Claudia Mayoa. She's joining us from Berlin, where she serves as the head of the International Security Research Division at the German Institute for International and Security Affairs, or Stiftung Wissenschaft und Politik, SWP. Claudia, herzlich willkommen.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. Nice to be here.
It's great to have you with us, and it's also great to have Ben Hodges with us today, who, after an early morning bus ride from Ithaca, New York, has made it to Manhattan just in time. For those of you who don't know him, Lieutenant General Ben Hodges is Senior Advisor at Human Rights First and the retired Commanding General of U.S. Army in Europe. Ben, it is always great to see you. Thanks for joining us.
Yeah, danke für die Einladung.
So, Ben, I'd like to start with you. In our so-called green room, we were talking a little bit about the mood in Germany, and in the course of our conversation, we'll come back to that. But you are based in Frankfurt. You're watching the U.S. from afar. I would love to have you sort of help set the stage for us in terms of how the new administration in Washington, regardless of whether it's a Harris administration or a Trump administration, might approach national security issues and sort of the plethora of foreign policy challenges that we know about, but also the ones that might be sort of on the horizon and have not yet crystallized yet. In broad brushstrokes, it would be great if you could paint a picture for us of how you see each of these new administrations approaching national security issues.
So clearly there is a lot of anxiety. I think, where I live in Frankfurt, about what a Trump administration would mean. It's there's a lot of anxiety about that because people remember what Trump did and said when he was the president and what he had said on the campaign trail and the people around him. And so, you don't get the sense that a Trump administration, based on what we know and what we have seen, that it will be very pro-transatlantic or even specifically towards Germany. Having said that, it will be very interesting to see who he brings in, who would be part of an administration. If it's people like Grenell or McGregor, people like that, I'm not going to be very optimistic. But I do think that supposedly, the Republican strong suit, according to them, is that it's all, business. They're good for business. They're good for investment. And so I think if that's the case, then they will be very aware that America's biggest trading partner, of course, is Europe, and that American prosperity depends on European prosperity. So perhaps because of that, the Trump administration will still be focused in a positive way with regards to business. A Harris administration, again, this is going to be my own speculation, and it will depend on who she brings in on her team. But I would anticipate that she will continue many of the transatlantic sort of initiatives, the efforts, the focus on NATO, the interest in European security. And I think actually probably more decisive, more clear than is the current Biden administration. So, you know, obviously, as you know, I have endorsed Vice President Harris. That's who I hope wins this. Not just because I think she'll be more pro-transatlantic, more pro-NATO, but also because she's not a threat to our Constitution. And I am very concerned about the threat that Donald Trump presents to our Constitution.
Mm-hmm. It's a great way to start. And I want to bring Claudia into the conversation right away, sort of picking up on this note that Ben started with of anxiety in Germany, and elsewhere in Europe. I mean, it's certainly something that I observed last week when I was in Berlin. Everybody wants to know who's going to win, and everybody seems to want to know, seems to want the answer of it will be Harris. We can't say that right now because the race is really far too close. And it remains to be seen. But responding to Ben's description of what a Trump administration could look like, what a Harris administration could look like, I'm curious whether you could share with us what you think the implications for Europe are, and whether Europe, and specifically Germany, is ready for pending changes.
Thanks for that, and particularly thanks, Ben, for describing so perfectly the fear, the big fear in Europe. I think this is anxiety is really the good word, because the conversations here are to a large extent characterized by the fear of it might be Trump. We are not ready. That's the first answer to your question. And what to do. And sometimes it's anxiety, and you might have felt it when you were in Berlin, anxiety coupled with almost this kind of being paralyzed. On the one hand, you have lots of activity. I mean, if you look at in Berlin, there's so many events in the moment, preparation for the elections, then on the election day, then post-election. It's the one and only topic we are having in the moment. And it's a mix of preparations and this kind of whatever happens, we don't know what to do. And I mean, we have in Europe almost got used to being very concerned about elections. I remember the elections in France, which we were very much concerned. But this is really a kind of fundamental existential anxiety. So the understanding that if this election will really make a huge difference for Europe. So if I take the question, is Europe ready? I mean, after what I just said and what Ben said, you don't expect me to say yes. So I think the question is just, Europe is trying to get ready, but getting ready means to understanding what's actually the challenge we have in front of us. And if the US were to elect a transactional president, one who pays less attention to alliances worldwide, not only in Europe, but worldwide, who might be more inward looking, who refers less to international rules, who refers less to democracy, who might disintegrate or deconstruct democracy from within, and who might actually take decisions that go against European interests. I mean, then we will be in big trouble. And you can break that down from the more abstract level to a more graspable level, and that would be the support for Ukraine will be questioned. The support for European defense will be questioned. The support for international order and international relations will be questioned. And all that are basic parameters for Europe. So if I take just one tiny example, not tiny, actually a big example, which is European defense. You can't easily replace what the US is doing in terms of European defense. It's political leadership, put in an easy way, keeping the house together. That means launching initiatives, keeping all the countries together, forging consensus, driving the countries forward for more investment, for more innovation. So political leadership can't be that easily replaced. Conventional capabilities, mass, can't be replaced. The Americans are bringing critical enablers, targeting, surveillance, intelligence, all that, which Europeans simply don't have. And the third element, nuclear deterrence, they are the major pillar for NATO. So all those three things, you can't replace it. And that also means if we talk about European defense, there's less America, it's not only about filling holes. It's not like, oh, the Americans don't give 5 planes, we put 5 planes in. No, this will be a totally different way of thinking defense and deterrence in Europe. And I think we are kind of understanding in Europe, it's not like they're not longer around. It's like rethinking. Again, don't get me wrong. I don't think whoever wins the elections, that the US will disappear. But I'm convinced that the transatlantic relationship, European defense, and international relations will fundamentally change depending on who will run the show in Washington. And that requires from us not only filling holes, but rethinking processes, doctrines, all that. So it's actually totally major homework.
So let me push you on that, and then also bring Ben back in. You know, I personally agree with you completely, in as much as I don't think that the United States will disappear from the world stage regardless of who wins. But I also think that regardless of who wins, the next administration will be more inward looking, given the challenges that we're facing domestically. And I think that the next president and his or her government will expect more of Europe. This is not going to be the first president who's done that. I mean, obviously, we saw that during Trump's first time in office, but we also heard it from the Obama administration, from the Biden administration, that Europe has to do more. And so, you know, I'm sensitive to what you were just saying, Claudia, about rethinking European defense and the difficulties inherent in replacing the United States, both in terms of leadership, but also in terms of conventional and nuclear, conventional weapons and nuclear deterrence. That's not going to happen overnight, but we haven't arrived at this point overnight, right? There have been many opportunities for Europe to step up and do more. I'd be interested in hearing from both of you about sort of why that hasn't happened yet, and how you know, and whether you think this change in leadership in Washington might finally be the catalyst that encourages European nation states, but the EU as a whole, to do more. I don't know, Claudia, do you want to go
Sure.
first?
I just spoke. You want? I can. Okay. I mean, there are obviously a lot of reasons, but I think there are 2 reasons that for me are the most crucial. The first is threat perception. I mean, since NATO has been created, we have the burden sharing debate. And I'm old enough to remember Gates, I think, talking about strategic irrelevance if Europeans don't speed up. Then when was it? 2013 or I mean, it's not new. It's so terribly old. And Europeans, after the end of the Cold War, didn't feel threatened, or not threatened enough to invest a lot. Some countries did, like Poland and the Baltic countries, and they invested. France and the UK had big ambitions, so they invested. But others, like my country, felt we are surrounded by friends and we don't need it. And we can solve our problems by political, diplomatic means. So the threat perception that would lead to bigger investment in defense was simply not there. If I just take the case of my country, Germany, I would say, since unification, did security policy mainly out of solidarity and because we wanted to be a good ally. Not so much out of threat perception. Our military, okay, they had that threat perception. But for a large extent, the political class when we went to Afghanistan, we went there to be a good ally within NATO and for the Americans. When Germany took the lead in one of the NATO contingents in the Baltic countries, this was to be a good ally, a good partner for the smaller countries. So it was security policy, not so much because it was about us, but because Germany wanted to be a good ally. We didn't feel threatened. That changed with the renewed Russian invasion in 2022. This is when Germany felt, this is about us. We have to do defense and security policy because we are threatened. But for a long time, we didn't have that threat perception. So you can invest the money in a different, in different budgets. And the second is that although the Americans always said you have to do more, there were hardly any consequences. The Americans said you have to, and the Europeans said, yeah. And the Americans said, okay, but you really have to. And we said, yeah, and there wasn't much consequences. So from a European point of view, the Americans did it for us. I don't say it's good. I think it's really, I don't know the English word for that. It's irresponsible that the Europeans didn't invest in their own protection. And I think we should be ashamed that we constructed such an amazing political entity like the European Union, and we are not able to protect it by our own means. We should be ashamed of that. So the ambition to invest more on defense should not be that the Americans are leaving or might be leaving. The ambition or the incentive why we do more on defense is because we want to protect what we have built in Europe. That should be the real driving force. So the question is not how many holes do we have to fill when the Americans leave? The question we need to ask is, what does it take to defend Europe? And from there, get our homework. And this is what we have in the NATO defense planning. Actually, it's pretty straightforward. Take the NATO plans and fill them. Then we have our European homework. But then again, I come back to what I initially said, what is the European way of war? What is the European way of deterrence? So if the Americans reduce their commitment, I don't think they will leave, but if they reduce it, we have to rethink the whole system integration role that the Americans have been playing so far. I have been too long. I hand over to Ben, and I'm certain we come back to that topics.
Well, I love listening to Claudia because she made me think of so many things. I was writing notes as fast as I could as I listened to her. So let me touch on like 3 or 4 different things. They're not in any kind of a sequence, but your question and Claudia's comments made me think of these things. First, this notion of must do more. She's right, of course, that every president since Truman has said our allies have got to do more. The problem is that's not compelling. I mean, what does that mean? Do more. And so finally now, after the Vilnius summit last year, the alliance finally agreed on approved regional defense plans. And, while this may not seem so significant, having plans, that's what generates requirements. I mean, that's a real requirement. And all the nations are signed up for these plans. So this is something much more specific than you're not at your 2%, whatever. I mean, we've got countries that have been at 2% from the beginning that do not have very good military capability. So that's only a metric. The key is, can you fulfill all the requirements that are generated by these NATO plans for regional defense from Finland all the way down to the Black Sea? So now this is something much more concrete. And the alliance or the U.S. could turn to Germany and say, hey, you're obligated for very specific things in terms of force capabilities, logistics, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I think this will be a little bit more compelling. And I am sure that people in the Bundeswehr will be glad to have a specific requirement placed on the German government. So that's, I think, specificity of must do more will help make some progress in that regard. The second thing I would say, agree again completely that it's about threat perception. I mean, for the same reason that teenagers don't think that they need health care because they think they're going to live forever, countries that feel they're never going to be attacked don't feel they need to invest a lot of money in
Right.
defense. And so finally getting to the point where allies recognize, understand what the threat really is. And for a national leader, when you recognize it, then you have to do something about it. So that will be the key. And when I look at what's happening in Ukraine, if Ukraine fails, it will only be because the United States and Germany allowed it to fail. We turned our back, or we didn't do what was necessary for them to actually win. And who's going to be the biggest loser other than Ukraine? It's going to be Germany, because Germany is going to be the biggest loser because you're going to have millions more Ukrainian refugees all heading to Frankfurt, Munich, Berlin, Dusseldorf, everywhere else where they think they can find safety and a job. So millions, that's with the M, more refugees coming to Germany, as well, obviously, as Poland and Romania. That will put an enormous burden already on the social systems. Russian victory in Ukraine will continue the disruption of food supplies that not only disrupts grain going to Africa and the Middle East, it affects food prices for all of us, even in the United States. Same thing with continued disruption of energy supplies. So there's nothing good coming out of Ukraine failing. And then Germany's credibility as a leader in Europe will be in the toilet. I mean, it will be seen as having failed, along with us, to protect a European country from Russian aggression. I think this will be a terrible outcome for the Federal Republic. Now, I thought the meeting 2 weeks ago, hosted in Berlin, hosted by Chancellor Scholz, with Prime Minister Starmer, President Macron, and President Biden, was a terrible, terrible meeting. First of all, nothing significant came out of it. And it looked like old Europe meeting together with two of the four countries represented not doing enough for defense. And UK, while they might be at 2% because of some slightly questionable financial accounting, is also an underperformer. Why was Poland not a part of this? Why were other countries not a part of this meeting? What was the purpose of it? If it was just a farewell, hey, thanks, Joe, for all your decades of service to transatlantic relations, that's one thing. But I thought it was a terrible visual, and it accomplished nothing. The last thing I'd say is I actually have optimism that at some point, European countries, and it probably won't be the ones we'd expect to be the leader, will in fact inspire, force other countries to actually do more. If you add together the economic power of all the countries of the European Union, so without UK, without US, without Canada, the economic power dwarfs Russia. Mm-hmm. So it's not that Europe can't make more ammunition, can't develop more, can't produce more capability. It's the political will that lacks. I have spoken recently with one of the major European or German defense industry leaders. They have excess capacity. They're sitting around waiting for orders. So it's not like they can't do it.
Yeah.
They need political will manifested as orders.
Yeah, I want to pick up on one of the themes that you both talked about in this incredibly rich conversation, and that has to do with the threat perception and recognizing what the threat really is. Ben, I'm grateful that you did a little bit of a deeper dive into Ukraine, and I definitely want to come back to Ukraine. But one would think that Russia's war in Ukraine would hammer home what sort of a threat exists and would be a real wake-up call that, as we've been talking about, more needs to be done to shore up European defense and particularly German defense. I'm always somebody who's trying to find lessons, and I'm wondering why the war in Ukraine has not been more of a wake-up call in a country like Germany, but also across Europe. Do either of you have any thoughts on why that message has not been hammered home yet?
The easy question for me. I think it actually was understood. If you look at the Zeitenwende speech, those of you who
Yep.
haven't read it, I really wholeheartedly recommend it. It's a speech that Chancellor Scholz made on 27th of February, so 3 days after the renewed Russian invasion in the Bundestag. And this is where he said, we live through a Zeitenwende, so a change of eras. Nothing will be like it was before. We will spend 100 billion on the Bundeswehr. We will spend 2%. We will buy F-35. We will deliver weapons to Ukraine and many other things. And when I listened to that speech, I remember it was a Sunday morning. It was a special session of the Bundestag. I was like, this is a revolution. All the things he announced, I didn't expect in my professional life to happen. So we had this moment that you just described. And the polls after that day in Germany gave a huge support for 2%, 100 billion, and F-35, which were all toxic topics just weeks before in the election campaign. Mm-hmm. So there was a threat perception and an awareness, and there was a willingness to make an effort. But then I come back to what Ben just said, it needs political leadership to keep that to keep that idea alive. So you need political support from the highest level who says, this is what we have to do because it's worth it, because we have to defend our way of doing things, because we have to defend our interests and our values. And I think with that, there was the initial willingness to do so, but if it's not regularly explained and defended, why would you do hardship? And I think, to be very honest, we missed that opportunity. And I think that this initial sense of urgency was very clear in Germany until the summer 2022. And spring 2020, summer 22, when the Ukrainians pushed the Russians back from Kiev and the war concentrated on the Donbass and the land bridge, there was this impression in Germany like, okay, the big danger is away. It's not longer about us, as initially said. It's a horrible war, but the big danger that war might spill over into Western Europe, it's gone. And my impression is that the urgency and the willingness to accept hardship in the political level disappeared. Not from all. I'm a big fan of our Defense Minister Pistorius. I think our Foreign Minister Baerbock, they both do a great job in explaining it. But in other places, there's less. And I think if you don't have the political leadership who say, this is why we need it, it is very difficult to change the DNA of a country, because in the end, what we do with Zeitenwende is to change the DNA of a country, how you behave in defense. A last point, so I think we have very different levels, or we have gaps in the threat analysis. In Europe, East, North, very aware of what's happening, very aware of the Russian threat. Finland, Denmark, the Baltic countries, Poland, no doubt, they raised their defense budget, they entered NATO, Finland and Sweden. They gave lots of weapons to Ukraine, no doubt about their threat analysis. The further you move away, the less the countries have historical experience with Russia, like being wiped off the card like the Baltic countries. Less investment in defense, less threat perception. Think of Portugal, Spain, Italy. And then you have, again, differences inside each country. So in Germany, our Chod, our highest soldier, he talks about Europe having a deadline for defense, which is 2029 or 2030. This is when we have to be ready Russia might be ready for war. But then you have other groups in the German public whose call for stopping weapons delivery to Ukraine and to think about re-engaging with Russia. So I think what we have to recognize, we have very different levels of threat perception in Europe and within each country, and partly even within each political party. That's the German case. So we don't have this kind of one understanding, but a very multi-level game, which is very difficult to address. Don't know whether you would agree, Ben. Please give me some hope, maybe. Make me optimistic.
Well, you said something that was so accurate. the reaction after the Zeitenwende speech was everything that I could see and feel and hear where I was in Frankfurt was a positive response. In fact, after everything that Germany has done since 2016, the decision to deploy Enhanced Forward Presence Battle Group, the decision to deploy the Brigada Litauen, the brigade to Lithuania, everything that Germany has done, the public seems to say, okay, it's the right thing to do. And so you would think that a savvy politician would use that positive, build on that sort of support. But I think this is where at least the Bundeskanzler either lacks self-confidence, doesn't trust that the support will last, or he is having such a difficult internal fight with his own left wing inside the SPD that he feels he cannot do more. But I remember when Dr. von der Leyen was the defense minister, she visited us in Wiesbaden, and she was talking about like how when they had made the decision to deploy the battle group, she goes, not one protest, nobody complained about it. So for me, the idea of leaders speaking to their voters, their citizens as adults is very important because I think most people, if you explain, here's what's at stake, here's why we have to do this. Yes, we're going to have to pay for it. Yes, there's a cost. But if we don't, here's what happens. And if you can convey that in a way that doesn't sound like political spin, then I think most people will say, oh, okay. But if they don't feel like they're being talked to like adults, then there's skepticism. And of course, the Russians are putting huge amounts of money into disinformation efforts all over Europe, as well as we know here in the United States. So competition in the information space is as important as having well-funded militaries, intelligence agencies, et cetera.
Let me fold in a viewer question that I think ties in here nicely, and I'll sort of rephrase it a little bit. The viewer is curious if in a second Trump administration, but I would say regardless of who wins, whether it's Harris or Trump, how can Germany leverage all of the significant changes that have happened in the last few years, right? Claudia, you talked about the Zeitenwende, which was a wake-up call, and I agree with you completely on that. And we have seen some incredible changes in terms of Germany reducing its dependence on Russian oil and gas completely. We've seen Germany step up in terms of defense spending, the commitment of 100 billion euro. We've also seen Germany develop a national security strategy, as well as a China strategy in terms of trying to help shape relations with other countries as well. And so, do either of you, or do each of you see a way of building on some of these successes and using those as stepping stones to have the kind of engagement that the next administration will really want to see from Germany and from Europe? Ben, do you want to go first this time?
Yeah, okay. I was hoping to cheat off of whatever Claudia says, but she's going to make me go first. This is an interesting question, building on successes, but the government has got to talk about those successes, and I think that I have to say, perhaps it's because of a lack of self-confidence. I'm not sure. And so, when I hear all the time, you have German leaders are dragging around suitcases full of guilt. And so there's a reluctance to talk about, look what we have done on something other than cars or football. I was speaking to a group of students at Goethe University back a little while back, and I asked them, or was talking to them about the German Enhanced Forward Presence Battle Group that was deployed in Litauen. And this was not an economics class or a literature class. This was an international relations class. Almost none of them even knew that Germany had a battle group deployed in Lithuania. Now, these are smart, intelligent young women and men in an international relations class, and they had no idea. So this is where I think the government, as well as the Bundeswehr, but the government has a responsibility to talk about what all these things that are being done. I think it's too easy to sit around and meckern all the time and complain about things, or to, well, you know, our neighbors will be concerned if Germany starts talking in a way that talking about how good the Bundeswehr is or how big it's getting or whatever. I've got to get past that. Otherwise, I think Germany forfeits the moral authority it has earned over the last 80 years, and really is losing the opportunity to lead and kind of help shape Europe in the future.
I totally agree. I mean, I totally agree with what Ben said. And I think maybe we could call it the difference between homework and conviction, you know? Something you have to do, you kind of feel you have to, but you actually don't believe in it. And conviction is you go out and you tell your people, you tell your public, you tell your citizen, we have to do this because we want that, because we are convinced it's in our own interest. So it's not doing this kind of hiding this dirty defense stuff. And if we can avoid talking about it, we do. But going out and say, this is what we want to do because we need to do it and because it's worth it. We have this debate, Ben, you have followed that certainly in Germany, about people who say, oh, I wouldn't fight for that country. I wouldn't defend my country. And this is, I mean, this is a moment where you have to stand up and say why it's worth it. So you have to explain what the threat perception is, and that is what the defense minister and our CHOD are doing in a really excellent way. And you have to explain how Europe's security has changed, that we have a neighbor who is willing to wage war to get what he wants. So you have to explain that even if we as Germans think military is a very special instrument and we have to be very careful for historical reasons, if we have a neighbor in front of us who is waging a conventional war and using nuclear threats, we better have an answer. So we have to explain the threat perception. And then you also have to say that we as Germany, as the biggest country in Europe, we have a particular responsibility in defending Europe and in doing our part in that. And I think if you go out, and that's the experience that our defense minister has done, people listen to. Pistorius, normally in Germany, the defense ministers, we call it an ejection seat ministry. You know, you enter with a good career option and you leave, you know, exactly. And Pistorius for a very long time is the most liked minister in the minister rankings because he is speaking truth to people. He's explaining, and he's doing that so well that people understand and buy in. He is talking a lot about the Lithuania Brigade. He's explaining why 2% is not enough, why we need 3%. So if we talk about Zeitenwende, you know, we can tick boxes. We can say we buy F-35, we spend 2% on defense, 100 billion special budget, cutting energy dependency, writing a China strategy, doing defense political guideline. That's all nice. Huh? The real thing about Zeitenwende is a mental Zeitenwende. Is to recognize that something has fundamentally changed in a long-term perspective and we can't carry on the way we did. It's not going to be over tomorrow. And I think this mental mindset change, so this mental Zeitenwende, it takes time. Don't expect a country to change in 2 years' time. Don't expect too much, but you have to put it on rails in the right direction. And this mental Zeitenwende, you get it by political work, by political conviction, by explaining, going out and explain. And again, this is what Pistorius is doing, great style, but we would need that more. I could now end on a very pessimistic side and say we haven't done enough, you know. Let me be for once optimistic and say we have an election campaign ahead. We have federal elections in September 2025. I really hope that the election campaign might be a moment where politicians go out and explain why it's actually worse to be able to defend what we have built in Europe.
Mm-hmm. I mean, as you both know, over the last couple of years, we've seen each other on the sidelines of the Munich Security Conference, and that's always been a great opportunity for me to speak with members of Congress and members of the Bundestag about the challenges that they face about making the case for supporting Ukraine in their electoral districts. And they all talk about how hard it is to make the case, but also how important it is. And so, Claudia, I think I agree with you that as Germany sort of focuses on its federal election next September, this could be a time to make that case again. Here in the US, of course, foreign policy is not at the top of the agenda in terms of either of the election campaigns. But sticking with Ukraine, Ben, I'd like to ask you a question of sort of what do you make of this almost promise by former President Trump that he could end the war in Ukraine within a day or in a phone call? I don't see that, but I'd love to hear sort of your assessment of how that could look and what that could look like. For me, it sounds like capitulation.
Well, that's exactly what it is, as it was in Afghanistan when he made a deal with a surrender to the Taliban without informing all of our allies who had been with us for almost 20 years in Afghanistan, or even the Afghan government, and then made the Afghan government hand over 5,000 Taliban prisoners, which promptly showed up as part of the assault and overthrew the government. So that's exactly what a Trump deal would look like. I think most people, all serious people, recognize that this is a total Trump nonsense. That it's not something. And by the way, the Ukrainians are not going to go along with that. They're not going to say, okay, well, the American president said we have to surrender now, because they know what happens when the Red Army shows up. So I think regardless of what we do, the Ukrainians will continue to fight. And I think they will get help from Poland and other countries who are very worried about what happens if Ukraine were to fail. So that's, I guess that what I would say is there's not going to be a Trump-Putin deal about Ukraine that involves Ukraine having to surrender or roll over or give up everything that Ukraine or Russia has occupied now, which is probably what it would be. The offer is you can keep this there, Vladimir, but don't attack Ukraine anymore, or else I'm going to let them have whatever, as if this was, the middle of the 18th century somehow. Mm-hmm. Now, all my European friends, my neighbors, should be very concerned about a deal like this, because if Russia is allowed to keep, what they have occupied, which is about 20% of Ukraine, and including Crimea. By the way, keep that in mind. When you hear somebody say there's no way Ukraine can win, Russian victory is inevitable, 10 and a half years since this war started, with Russia having every advantage, they only occupy about 20% of Ukraine. The Black Sea Fleet is no longer a factor in this war. The Russian Air Force has totally failed the two most important tasks of achieve air superiority and interdict the lines of communication. Not one train coming from Poland into Ukraine has been destroyed. Not one convoy, not one. That's an incredible failure. Russia's lost 600,000 casualties, which Putin doesn't care about as long as these are not casualties from St. Petersburg or Moscow. But they're having to turn to North Korea for people, most of their ammunition. Iran. So that tells you what kind of terrible shape the Russians are in. So I don't know why there's so much pressure on Ukraine to roll over, give in, negotiate, and let Russia keep what they have. Now, back to the point I was trying to make, though, if Russia keeps Crimea and the Donbass, that means nobody with real money is going to invest in the reconstruction of Ukraine. At Munich Security Conference, I spoke to a person who's the vice president at one of the two largest investment firms on the planet, and he said no way would they invest real money into the reconstruction of Ukraine if it looks like war was going to resume again. And so with Russia sitting there in Crimea and in the eastern quarter of Ukraine, they're waiting for us to lose interest. And then, of course, you'll have continuation of disruption of fuel and grain, rare earth materials, and you're going to have millions more Ukrainian refugees. So I see no positive outcome for Germany or anybody else in Europe if a Trump administration pressures Ukraine to accept some kind of a settlement.
Claudia, you were taking notes, so I think you have something to add, but I'd love to have you fold in another element. A couple of our viewers have been curious about something that Ben touched on, which is the reports of North Korean troops being in Russia to support the war efforts in Ukraine. And it would be interesting to hear from you what you think the significance of that is.
Thank you. I mean, I totally subscribe to the points that Ben made, and when you said whether your neighbors are concerned or should be concerned, I mean, totally. I think North Korea shows us that this shows us the internationalization of the war, if I might say. You in the US, you talk about the axis of upheaval. We Europeans don't like the term, but the idea is the same. You have countries like Iran, North Korea, China, who openly support Russia. It's not a silent kind of we help in the background, but it's a clear support. And it's not only they supporting Russia, but you have lots of linkages between those countries. I'm not sure the word axis is the right word. I think it's more many bilateralism that do something that then add up. But it's very clear that Russia has support and Russia is not isolated. You might remember that Joe Biden said some days after the renewed invasion in 2022, he said, we will make sure that Russia will be a pariah on the international scene. And if you look around, Russia certainly is not a pariah. So there are countries who enable Russia to carry on in that war for a very long time. And North Korea is probably the one we should be the most ashamed that they do more than the Europeans, even if we call our initiatives as soon as possible, like this ASA ammunition initiative. I mean, but it particularly shows us that there's clear support for Russia from many countries, and they don't hide away. I think what we Europeans have to understand is that the Russian threat is a structural one. As long as Russia keeps its goals, and as long as Russia says Ukraine has no right to exist as an independent sovereign state, and there's no Ukrainian identity as independent of Russia, as long as Russia is sticking to those goals, and as long as Russia has the military means to wage a war, so to reach those goals by waging war, as long as that is the case, Ukraine will be threatened. And so if you have the goals and you have the means to reach them, the risk of war is still there. And not only for Ukraine, but also for us in Europe. You might remember the treaties that Russia suggested in December 21 and in January 22, where they requested that military installation of NATO be taken off the new states in the Baltics and Poland. And they actually wanted to create a buffer zone between Russia and Western Europe. So it's not only about Ukraine, it's about reorganizing Europe. And I think we really have to understand it's not something that will stop if you get a capitulation plan like the one from Vance. And even if we would get to a ceasefire, because at some point maybe Ukraine is tired or American European support will be less, even if we arrive at the ceasefire, as long as the Russian goal remain as it is and it has an army to wage war, the whole question of securing peace or ceasefire is so important. Ben hinted at that with the reconstruction question. You have the security order question and you have the economic order question. You will only have full-scale reconstruction if you are safe. Who would invest in a country if he doesn't know the rocket is coming next morning? So you have to have a secure framework in order to, at full scale, rebuild the country. So even if at some point there will be a ceasefire, Europeans cannot say, oh, great, now we can go back to business as usual. Russia remains a threat as long as they stick to their ideas. So the question of securing peace is as big, as expensive, and as complex as supporting Ukraine to win. And just throw you some numbers at you to just grasp the task we have in front of us. The border between Russia and Ukraine is about 2,000 kilometers. The border between Belarus and Ukraine is about 1,000 kilometers. So if a sovereign Ukraine that hopefully wins that war, one day will there be as a free Ukraine and has to be protected against Russia, who has kept its ideas. It has to defend, to protect, to safeguard about 3,000 kilometers of border. And this is where they will need support from their Western allies if we are serious about protecting an independent, sovereign Ukraine. It means if we are serious about all the things we always say about our values and interests. So I think we have to be very clear about the long-term structural challenge we have in front of us. And the point Ben made, I can only underline it. Reconstruction at big scale requires security. And it's not over when we have a ceasefire. It will just be different. And this is what we have to understand. And then we come into all the questions of NATO membership, of EU membership. This all requires long-term commitment to security for Ukraine, which means security for us. A secure Ukraine is one of the best security protection we can have in Western Europe.
I mean, I think what you've just touched on now, is sort of a strong call for a strong case for multilateralism, for allies, for partners, for institutions like NATO. And obviously that's going to be something that will be called into question depending on how the US election goes in less than 2 weeks. And so I'd like to, you were raised, did you want to say something?
Yeah, maybe just a quick note and then I'll hand over to Ben. I mean, the memories of Trump in Europe are very diverse. If I talk to my Baltic and Polish friends, they say, yeah, I mean, politically a little bit rocky, but in practical terms, the Trump administration gave weapons to Ukraine.
Yeah.
They stationed troops in Poland. They actually finally kicked the Germans a little bit. They told the Germans to spend more, which many countries liked, So many countries like the Baltic countries and Poland, they don't have that bad souvenirs of Trump.
Yeah.
The Germans and the French, very different. We remember a very transactional, very rocky, questioning about the solidity of Article 5, questioning European deterrence and defense. But this bad souvenir that the Germans and the French, for example, have is not shared in all Baltic countries or Poland. And even if I talk to Republican colleagues, the call for more burden sharing, I mean, I'm all in. The question is whether the call for burden sharing is actually translated into the questioning of the very basis of the alliance. And this, honestly, from Europe, I can't say. So
I mean, I think
Ben
you're absolutely
will tell us
right in differentiating, right? And as you've done throughout this conversation, there's not one European perspective, there's not one national perspective. It varies from region to region, but also within countries. And I do think that that's an important point to make. Ben, did you want to weigh on this as well? So because as we start to wrap up, I wanted to ask you a question that sort of pulls some of these threads together and comes back to the framing question for this event, as to whether this is the end of an era. One of the questions I've seen circulating a lot in the German press has been whether Joe Biden is the last transatlanticist who serves as president. And I think from what you were just saying, Claudia, about the different perceptions of Trump, depending on where in Europe one is, I'd be curious to hear from each of you whether you think that this era is coming to an end with President Biden no longer being a president, and with a Trump 2 or a Harris administration in the offing?
No, I don't believe that. Look, Americans traveling to Europe now is for tourism, for business, is as high as it has ever been and increasing. American business interests, our prosperity is tied to European prosperity. I think that whoever the next president is still going to recognize that not only are our economic interests there, but also we cannot do anything by ourselves, and most of our most reliable allies come from Europe. So I anticipate if it's a Trump administration, of course, it won't be fun for a lot of people, but I think the Germans are in danger of missing a gigantic opportunity here, thinking proactively, okay, Trump's going to be the guy, then let's make sure that we don't have an empty phone book on November the 6th, and think about, working with the different American states, particularly places like North Carolina and South Carolina that have huge German business interests that are there, and where you have a Republican governor in South Carolina, making sure he knows it's in his interest that these German businesses are prosperous, not the victim of some sort of Trump retribution or some economic policy that doesn't make sense. So my sense is that the German government and business people this time are going to be more clever than they were 8 years ago at the beginning of the Trump administration, less moralizing, more practical aspects. On the other hand, I think that the U.S., are going to regret, if it's a Trump administration, that for whatever reasons, if we don't encourage, support, cajole a unified Europe, we're going to lose a seat at the table and the chance to have the strongest, wealthiest allies in the world.
Mm-hmm. Claudia, the last word goes to you.
So much pressure. I think if it's an end of an era, you only know retrospectively. So I don't know, but that's maybe the easy answer. 3 very brief points. I think the first is, if you still have joint interests and values, you will cooperate. So it's on us to define those joint interests and values. The second is the point I made earlier, that the reference for the Europeans should not always be what can we do to keep the Americans in, or to please them, or to do something, but you say, what do we actually want? Do we want to be able to defend our continent or not? Do we want to live like in Russia, or maybe not? So I think we should think more about what we actually want as Europeans. It doesn't mean to kick the Americans out, but kind of what do we actually want? That also makes us a more attractive partner. And the third is just to say that if we want to understand each other, Europeans and Americans, we need formats like this, where you have a European and American, and even better, American who lives in Europe, to kind of translate what we think to better understand each other. So it's always a pleasure to listen to Ben and to discuss with Ben. So I think do more of that stuff. That also keeps the transatlantic relationship going.
Well,
I give you homework.
It's always a pleasure to talk to the two of you. I certainly learn a lot every time I'm able to engage with the two of you, and I hope that the participants in this webinar are taking a lot away as well. I want to thank you both for this incredibly thoughtful but also thought-provoking exchange, and hope that we can continue to have these kinds of exchanges, with both of you and with others as well. But I really appreciate both of you taking the time for this discussion at a very busy time for each of you. And ich weiß es zu schätzen. I'm deeply appreciative of the fact that both of you have had this conversation with us today. So thank you both very, very much.